Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, almost evening. On behalf of Mills College at Northeastern University, I'm happy to welcome you to this event on the histories of Indigenous education, where we will be hearing from two authors of recent works, our own Professor Natalee Kēhaulani Bauer and also Sarah Whitt, who will be joining through Zoom. Thank you so much. Also to our esteemed colleagues here who are part of producing this event. They are from the Indigenous Education Working Group. We're proud to have them here on our campus and meeting and joining us to have responses to the work. I think that's great that we have our folks who can dialogue about these issues. So on behalf again of the Dean and our Mills College at Northeastern, thank you for coming. Thank you all of you for joining us for this event. And I know that there are others watching online now because it is a hybrid event. We'll also be recording, and that way folks, if they didn't make it, might be able to catch the recording because I know this is important work that you all are doing. This event comes at the end of Sustainability Innovation Week, which is throughout Northeastern's various campuses. And for me, one of the things that's important to us at Mills College is that sustainability is a big question. And we want to look at the cultural and social aspects of this along with what's often highlighted, which is the environmental issues, et cetera. And so although this is not necessarily along those lines, the idea of cultural sustainability certainly is. And examining the histories of how education has not always benefited and in fact has terrorized some communities, including the Indigenous community. I know that these folks are in the fields of education. They're examining this, and it's important that we look at these ways that education has been used against communities of color, especially Indigenous folks and these systems of oppression. And also when we do that, we look to the future, right? We look to what is education? What is it supposed to be? What could it be? How can we have an education system that decolonizes some of these systems that have been in place? So I'm proud to kind of insert this into a conversation about sustainability of all things. And make sure that other voices are heard amidst that, amongst that, and also that students examine these from all angles, right? So without further ado, I'd like to invite Natalee Arvin to begin with introductions and welcoming us to what we're about to get into together in conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, aloha mai kākou. My name is Natalee Arvin. I'm a professor at the University of Utah. I'm Native Hawaiian, and it's my great pleasure to have these folks in conversation today, especially to celebrate and talk about these really two important books, Tender Violence in U.S. Schools by your own Professor Bauer, and Bad Medicine by our friend Dr. Sarah Whitt, who's joining us on Zoom. And yeah, so we're friends because I forced them all to be in a working group with me. And what that means is basically you get to, if you have funding, and this funding is through a Mellon Foundation grant that our Pacific Island Studies program at the University of Utah received. You get to like choose who you want to be in conversation with, or like the scholars that you think are like the coolest. And you get to like meet with them a few times over the course of a year and talk about each other's research and help each other with whatever you're working on, as well as, think about things we might do together. And so all of us in one way or another work on issues of boarding schools, Indigenous boarding schools that, use the technologies and tools and institutions of education to do violence to Indigenous communities. But also the ways we all also look at the ways that, you know, those histories are more complicated than what you might hear on the news, and that all of the Indigenous communities that are at the center of our work, you know, always challenged and resisted, and it's just the story is difficult and violent, but that's also not the whole story, if that makes sense. So yeah, I'm really excited to talk about these books today. I think I'll let folks introduce themselves as we go along. But I think we're gonna start out just by asking both Sarah and Natalee to say a little bit about their book for folks who might not have read it yet. And maybe just tell us a little bit about how you came to write it, and why. And if there are any particular stories that you tell in the book that you think are really emblematic of what you're trying to do with the book. And maybe, yeah, do you want to start, Natalee, and then we could get Sarah.
Can we spotlight Sarah? Yeah, can we put in her face?
Yeah, they're not visible right now, but yes, we will.
That's something with a question, right?
Oh,
Yeah.
No, okay. So yes, the question of how did I come to write this book, I think is an interesting one. I think it is, obviously. We'll see if you all do. So initially in my first career, I taught in public schools, mostly in Oakland. That whole back row is like my Oakland public school and maybe also San Leandro. My public school teachers in the back row. So I actually started off thinking about this as a middle school teacher, sitting in faculty meetings and having what felt like just ongoing discussions. You know, I had been in Oakland, and then I taught in San Francisco, and I taught in Berkeley. And no matter where we went in these, you know, ultra progressive cities, we would have the same conversations about why the majority of the kids we suspended were Black kids. And I had come freshly out of a master's in literature program, because that was a thing I did for a while here at Mills College, where I had written a lot about the relationship between white femininity and Black masculinity and how it's defined historically in opposition, right? And so I'm sitting in these meetings thinking like, well, as I look around the room, you know, the majority of teachers in the United States are white women, something like 83%, and that number is only increasing. So as our student body gets more diverse, the teaching field gets less diverse. And so being in my sort of, you know, like English literature head, I was like, well, wait a minute, we already know, like, am I the only one that knows this history? Like, we already know that there's something really ingrained in the cultural history of the United States about the opposition of Black masculinity and white femininity. And so why have we never asked the question in an institution that's predominantly led by white women, where we discipline Black students, particularly male students, but also students of all genders who are seen as hyper-masculinized behaviors? Why are we not interrogating that, right? Because what we always do in schools, and everybody, you know, like teachers are good people, right? So everybody's in there like, well, okay, let's start off, first of all, I'm not a racist, you're not a racist. So this can't be about race because we're not racists. We like to talk about class, we like to blame it on class, right? Which is just code for race. But we could never get past the conversation. We could never resolve the concerns because everyone was stuck in, well, it can't be about race, because I actually really love these kids. And it's because, you know, this kid, like, he's an exception because, you know, he threw a chair in class. So this kid, like, there's always an exception. There's always a reason why. It's not about race, it's about this individual kid, this exceptionalism, right? And so when I started my research, my dissertation at Berkeley, or not my dissertation, but my initial research, I was actually doing ethnographic research in the schools and talking to teachers and talking to students and trying to kind of uncover what was behind this in that way. And I realized in some ways it made me really uncomfortable to think about making any sort of big statements based on a certain school or a certain interaction. And also it was just really hard to get teachers to talk about race in a way. There's this sort of like cognitive dissonance when you see yourself as one of the good guys, right? Like, I'm a good person, I love to teach, I came into teaching because I care, which is true. But there's something about it where then people are like, therefore, I cannot also be doing that, right? And so because of that, it became really difficult to have any progress, any productive conversation. So then I thought, okay, if we take it entirely out of the present day and look at more sort of history and archives, maybe then I really was like, this is going to be the magic thing. It's going to all of a sudden make so much sense. People will understand systems. It's all going to be over after this. I was going to create the post-racial society. But it was, and then it just became really interesting to really get into the history. And I guess, I don't have to go on and on about that, but that is where it came from. It came from these ongoing discussions in very progressive schools about what is it that's possibly making all of the students who are suspended Black students, right? Like, I don't know, I have no idea. It's sort of like with the election results, right? People are like, well, what could it be? What could have happened? I don't know. Not race. So yeah, and so in terms of like a story in the book that speaks to all of this, I think what I like about it is that it continues to tell several different stories that seem like they're very different because of their location or their moments in time. But it just goes to show that the story in education has always been the same. From the time that we organized schooling, it's always been about heroism and loving, mothering sort of roles. And that there's this way that provides a shield to people where they just don't have to interrogate any sort of complicity in violence, right? Because you're protected by the heroism.
Sarah?
Halito, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me okay. I'm zooming in for my home in Irvine. Unfortunately, I came down with a virus and was too sick to get on the plane. So thank you for introducing the event and the space, Miley, and thank you for the question. Like Natalee, I came to the project also by way of personal experience. So my, and this story seems to get longer and longer each time I tell it, but my second great grandfather had a sister named Sarah Fowler who attended the Carlisle Indian School between about 1912 and 1916. And so Carlisle serves as sort of a point of departure for the book Bad Medicine. But when I was a doctoral student at UC Berkeley, I had access to institutional resources and spaces and, some of these archival materials, and I really wanted to dig into them and learn a little bit more about my relative, Sarah. So I was able to get a hold of her they are referred to as student files that painted a picture of a really interesting and vivacious young woman. She was 19 at the time, and she sent a lot of correspondence to various friends and also to Carlisle superintendents, often asking for additional funds of her own out of her savings to purchase clothes. So she was always talking about, I've done it again, I've spent all my money and I need some more money to go shopping. So I thought that was really interesting, and she was often being chastised for what was perceived to be sort of her spendthrifty nature. And from there, I got really interested in other experiences that might have challenged superintendents at the school or at the institution's expectations of these older students. And my relative was 19 when she graduated, so she was slightly older than what I had expected her to be, and certainly what many of us come to think about as being appropriately school-aged enrollees for this era. And so that sort of really piqued my interest, and I started digging into some disciplinary records and documents at Carlisle and came across one ledger in particular that was a really powerful archival moment for me that catalyzed the conceptualization of my dissertation, and then later on thinking back to it sort of helped me reconceptualize things for my book. But in this ledger, it was a ledger spanning a period of about a decade, and it was a discharge ledger where a Carlisle official, the school matron or whomever, enumerated each individual who departed from Carlisle in a given year or on a particular day. And there was one page in particular that really stood out to me, and that controverted a lot of the assumptions that I had about what I was going to find in these archival materials. And this page in particular represented what I have come to think about as a runaway event, but by virtue of the methodology that this colonial official utilized in enumerating these runaways, what she had done or he had done was list the name of the first student who ran away, and then in the column reason for departure listed runaway. And then there were about 10 subsequent students who ran away on the same day from Carlisle, this sort of mass exodus. And for each subsequent individual, she put a ditto mark. So there were about 10 ditto marks with runaway at the top. And that, to me, as a sort of novice historian, a doctoral student, really created this very powerful visual block of solidarity that I stumbled upon, right? That was a really powerful assertion of Indigenous presence when what I had expected to find in that particular ledger was Indigenous absence. And so that's kind of how I came to realize that, there were a lot of stories that could be told or revisited about older Indigenous enrollees at Carlisle. And on the whole, I found that many of the disciplinary documents that I was coming across in my research related to folks who were older than I had anticipated. So, early 20s as opposed to teenagers and that sort of thing. So that's a little bit about how the project started, and happy to talk more about how it developed. But there are so many different stories I could potentially offer up as representative of what I'm up to in the book. But I think one that really stands out to me is about a Apache guy named Justin. And I talk about him in the first chapter, and I see Farina and Derek nodding here. And he was 45 years old. The second time he arrived at Carlisle, he enrolled originally, or was enrolled in 1884 as a student. But the second time he arrived at Carlisle, he was paroled out to the institution as a parolee. And he was 45 years old when this happened. And I think that's really important and very unexpected, and illustrates a whole lot about the many purposes that Carlisle served, especially in later years, that were non-educational. And so in my research, what I found is that many of these older enrollees, folks that are, legal adults and beyond, early mid-20s, they were much more highly mobile than their younger counterparts. They experienced a wide array of discipline and punishment, and they moved around a lot. They were sent back and forth between institutions, and Justin's experience and the story that I share about Justin really illustrates that. He was paroled out from a jail, a prison in Arizona, to Carlisle because Carlisle was viewed as an appropriate receiving institution for a parolee, given its sort of disciplinary prerogatives and punitive mechanisms in place. Yeah.
Sarah. I think we're going to start by talking more about your book. So I'll let if Derek and Farina, if you all could first introduce yourselves, like where you're coming from and a little bit about your own research. And then Derek and Farina are going to start off with questions for Sarah. And then after that, Katie and I are going to ask Natalee's question.
Okay. Hello, everyone, for coming. Well, I'm Derek Tyra, the College of Education at the University of Hawaii, Manoa. I'm not Native Hawaiian, but I am of Okinawan mixed race background, and I've come to always embrace Hawaiian history and particularly education. And I come from a long line of teachers, and I've always been fascinated with education as an institution, not just a philosophy, but like a way of approaching understanding how knowledge has been communicated, but also how that knowledge is either weaponized, operationalized, withheld, given. So that kind of dynamic has always been a fascinating thing. And so, yeah, I teach the history of education in Hawaii, particularly on how Native Hawaiians have engaged with education in the 20th century. And so I really came to this book, and I appreciate opportunity, Violet, and coming together, meeting everyone here. Really been a great chance to build community, especially in these difficult times. And I've been drawing a lot of strength and just interest in what education can do and has been done, but what education can be as a way of promoting a sense of community, but also like survival. I can kind of really see that in the Indigenous experiences in education. And so Sarah, I'm very honored to be able to read your book, and I have a lot of comments and questions around the idea of how you were able to conceptualize Carlisle as an institution that is not a school. Like I really like that point that you kept reiterating and especially in chapter 1, the idea that Carlisle for many was not a school. I really appreciated this, and you mentioned in your introduction, this idea of institutionalization and the rhizomatic approaches that this effort to control Native bodies through education didn't just happen at Carlisle, but then Carlisle's influence spread widely, like as you say in that very clear way, rhizomatic, where it spreads out like tree roots, and it connects with other institutions, create kind of a police state of sorts. And the idea of deputization of other white people in particular to be able to then feel like, yeah, I can regulate and surveil and discipline Native bodies outside of Carlisle, demonstrating just how Carlisle is just one institution of larger societal approach of controlling Native peoples. And yeah, and just demonstrating that particular Justin. So when you mentioned Justin, I would have thought about how that was a great example of almost like a school prison pipeline kind of apparatus where even adults are being infantilized. Like you're talking, we made it very clear of how even adults at Carlisle were seen as children and treated as such, and where you give the dignity to be able to regulate their own movements. So it was very fascinating because I have a pretty good understanding of Native boarding schools history and Carlisle in particular, but I've never, your nuanced approach to it, I really appreciate it, demonstrating how, well, no, Carlisle was more than just a school, especially after when Pratt left in 1904, how the curriculum changes. And even that's just how the settler state is always finding ways to try and disempower Native people, and you say how the curriculum changes from kind of an academic setting to more of an industrial and I don't know, belittling in some ways that they're incapable of understanding the need to understand. I think you got that one letter about how a commissioner is talking about what do they need to know the square root of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And I mean, that's kind of just, it seemed like a very cruel way of trying to just demonstrate that Native people don't need information. So again, telling people what they need to know, withholding information and knowledge, and controlling what they need to, telling them what they need to know. So, all of that. I love the books, that's why I was really fascinated to see the connection. And I think one of my main questions is, how do you see, like I couldn't help but think of like, so contextualize my question. So in Hawaii, there was a recent around Christmas time, past Christmas, there was a county or a city, Honolulu, they had a open hearing on a particular issue. I forgot the issue, but then so a Kanaka Maoli activist came up and introduced herself in Hawaiian, gave her name, a little bit of background, translated it in English, and gave her testimony on a particular issue that was brought up. The following person came up, rather than address the issue that she was there to testify about, and public testimony to, she ripped into the Native Hawaiian person before her and explaining how I didn't understand anything. Why, how dare this person speak in another language I don't know? The translator, who translated, couldn't translate it. So I think it's Hawaiian, but Hawaiian's a dead language. And so this idea, right, this concept you're talking about, like just controlling Native people, telling them what is legitimate, what's not. We're kind of in that kind of moment again where there's a sense of empowerment, this kind of deputization that you bring up in that just goes beyond just education, but it does connect to education because a lot of the people are saying, no, Hawaiian is an active living language. But for this particular white settler, this was no, it's a dead language. And so therefore trying to enforce that in the public sphere kind of goes again to show that rhizomatic approach that you're talking about. So yeah, so my question is, how do are you seeing this, the history that you're talking about at Carlisle? Do you see at all, or how are you seeing it in today? And like what can we take from your book that help history inform the present of this current moment?
Yeah, that's a really wonderful question. Thank you so much, Derek, for your engagement with the book and with my ideas. It's really thrilling to hear what people are picking up on. I think, there are a lot of kernels of wisdom, I suppose, we can take away from the stories that emerge in the book and the experiences of the Native people who fought really assiduously to hold on, right, to their lifeways, their worldviews, their languages, their cultures, in spite of overwhelming odds in many cases, which is something that I think comes through very powerfully in the institutional protocols that are represented in the book, right? Looking not only at Carlisle, but looking at the private labor sector, or looking at an institutional space like the so-called Canton Asylum for Insane Indians, right? Institutional spaces that very persistently supported settler prerogatives and very persistently also defined Native people as lacking, but which unilaterally enticed, oftentimes, mostly and predominantly white American citizens to police and surveil and discipline and punish Native people, not just as a civic duty, but actually as an inherent right, right? And that's something that I talk about as well, this idea of status whiteness as being something that many white Americans willingly and gladly assumed and adopted and reinforced, and that sort of reinforced settler prerogatives and white supremacy in various capacities. And I think that, if we were going to take a genealogical approach to a lot of the legislation that we see today, I talk about this a bit in the epilogue to the book, actually, talking about Indigenous futurities. But a lot of these acts that we see, legislative pieces that we see criminalizing discourses around like critical ethnic studies, critical race studies, things of that nature, or enticing. There was some New York Times article pretty recently. It was an opinion piece. I think it was in 2022. That was talking about some piece of legislation out of Texas where, neighbors were supposed to report on one another if they suspected a woman had had an abortion, right? So some of these, it's like the coded rhetoric embedded in some of these initiatives that we see, in recent, very, very recent headlines. There are racial connotations to these endeavors, certainly, when we're talking about, like, we can't, teach about slavery or Indigenous genocide in the classroom, but other subtle ways in which I think this concept of white American deputization plays out today in very unexpected ways, right? So this idea that, like, in policing or surveilling your neighbor, reporting on them, deeming them unfit to be a citizen or whatever, right? I think that those actions and behaviors share the same sort of state-sanctioned, efforts in terms of genealogical connection to some of the things that I talk about in the book. So yeah, I appreciate that question a lot. Yeah, Yeah, I think I'll stop there. Hopefully I answered that sufficiently. Yeah.
No, I appreciate that because, pass it over to, Marina in a minute, but also, I kind of saw what you're talking about right in that moment, this idea of deputization, and just how it is reinforced by the state to then feel like there's a sense of justification to that, but it builds on to also what I remember was reading from, Natalee's book too, is this idea then of white benevolence, this idea that on top of not just the state apparatus legitimizing and deputizing white people to feel like they can do that, there's also this idea, well, I'm not racist, I'm doing this because I truly want to help. So there's this idea that when you have the state supporting it, and then there's also this idea of, well, they obviously, people of color cannot take care of themselves, so we have this role to then do it and create there's this kind of like philosophy, moral philosophy that I need to do it. And then on top of that, well, the state, then I can operationalize it through the state. Kind of creates this really larger system, just that is then extends beyond just a classroom, but it can extend into social work, it can extend into benevolent societies. Appreciate it. I'll second that. Yeah. Thank you again.
Thank you for that.
Yat she belegana nishre do kiani bashishchin belegana dashuche do sinijin dashanalen akot egot saf mishlet Marina King yet. Hello, Shikis do Shiket to my friends and relatives. That's how we introduce ourselves in B'nai Azad in Navajo language. I am of white American settler descent through my mother, and I'm born for the Towering House and Blackstreet Woods people of B'nai. As Navajo, we call ourselves, and I'm a citizen of the Navajo Nation, as well as a citizen of the United States. And that's saying something these days, right? And Ahiahet, thank you. Mahalo, Ahiahet, Wado. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this important conversation, these critical dialogues that I just wish, this room was filled. I'm grateful this is being recorded, even though it's really hard. We don't know who's targeting us, who's watching us. I live and work at the University of Oklahoma, which is Native America. That's Indian territory, where Choctaw Nation is based in that region, and 39 different Native nations who come from all over Turtle Island, Native America. There's also a really strong Chamorro community in Oklahoma City region, and convergences of so many people. I have relatives who are Diné in that area, and I'm honored to be here, Indigenous lands, wherever we are, wherever we stand. And there's so much to say. I shared a list of my questions with Sarah just a few minutes before this meeting. So thank you, Sarah. Thank you so much for this heart-heavy work. You need to have good medicine to even do this kind of work. And I can say that, for all of our colleagues who face a lot in just even opening up these really difficult, triggering, and traumatic stories. Why do we do this is, I think, what's really powerful about Sarah's work, and I love that part where she introduces a Choctaw concept of truth-telling. Sarah, you'll have to correct me with the pronunciation. I don't speak Choctaw, but Adlichi. Is that how you say it?
That's good. Exactly, Farina. Adichi.
Alichi, as she describes it on page 143 of her book, to make true, to establish the truth, to fulfill a promise. And I thought that concept was very, very powerful. And there's mention of the truth and healing work in the United States, of course, referencing to the truth and healing, truth and reconciliation work in Canada with First Nations. But that resonated a lot with me, and also different frameworks and concepts that Sarah introduces in the book. Even bad medicine, opening up with that. Why is this conversation about trans institutionalization, violence, why even medicine? What is the power of medicine? And what is the bad medicine? That sits heavy with me because I am the granddaughter of Hataflet. As Diné, we call our singers, but they are healers. Healers, or roughly translated, people often say medicine people and mislabel that as only medicine men, but many, of different genders who are healers. So I think about that a lot because when we talk about these different institutions, and as Sarah's work does so well, it takes us really up close to personal lives, names, even if we have to just say Jerome or, Ozette or these different people, her own relatives, Sarah Fuller. I appreciate Sarah mentioning that connection with her own relative and her own family history. I would have liked to see a little more of that in the book. It's like there's an image of her relative and a reference to that, because there is a really important underlying thread with Sarah's work that she emphasizes. This is coming from her positionality, a Choctaw person, and what she's paying attention to, what she's tracing, and also her voice coming through, and that this is ongoing work. There's a lot of work to still do. At the time of writing, this is what she's learned or what has gathered. So I appreciate that. But coming up close, that was so powerful for me to learn names of people who are left out of even the very few narratives that we get or come through when there's so much erasure, silencing. I mean, the violence continues in that effort to silence, forget, cover up, or turn away from the truth telling and the truths. And so that was really, really powerful for me. Because, even today, I'm wearing red because the Comanche Nation declared this day, March 14th, as a sovereign nation, that they are acknowledging Emily Pike, San Carlos Apache, 14-year-old girl, her body in pieces, found in pieces, not even all of them, of our murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. And all these things are connected. Emily was in a youth home when she went missing. And there is layers to this, more to unpack, of other children who have gone missing, youth from that home. And what are the what's happening about forms of human trafficking. So that's also, I think, really important here. I tried to look up if Sarah used the term human trafficking, and it wasn't necessarily framed that way, but all these things are so interconnected. And yet what's so revolting and frustrating about it, right, is the conversation of how the whole handle medicine, the medicinal labor, that these forms of institutionalizing violence, controlling, policing, imposing all kinds of influence and force on youth. And also what Sarah brings to light and exposure is these are not only small children, but full-grown adults. And the questioning of the legality of this kind of controlling of adults Why are they being treated as not only children, in many ways, the inhumanity, dehumanization that they go through? Whether it is, for me, it's like the story of Beautiful Mind, like mapping all this out. That is incredible in all this too. More, as Derek said, more than only a site of a school, Carlisle, which is infamous, but also very complicated and messy. That's a part of it too, is the stories of not only framing people as victims, or that this is some kind of victimhood porn or victimry porn, but there's more, as shared, as Melanie said earlier and others share, more to these stories. The multifacets of it, people's lives, their ingenuity, their creativity, what they do to survive, and not only survive, but to navigate, to, maneuver whatever way they can under the most unimaginable and some of the most dire circumstances. And many who did not make it, the deaths and the names that we have yet to say and to know, like Emily Pike and the others who we have yet to know. And so this is so incredible, such incredible work, because there's Carlisle, the industrial Indian school that is, all these prisons, forms of incarceration by another name. And then Carlisle to Good Shepherd Home, the Madeline Laundries, the connections to even Ireland, and to Ford Motor Company in Detroit, Michigan, and outing programs. The General Hospital in Lancaster, to the Canton Insane Asylum for Indians in South Dakota. And that also has a connection to our Carlisle, even though, others, it's very, even more direct and ties to these spaces and such. But I found that layer, so many layers to it. As students at Carlisle learned about Canton, it was in operation over some overlap in time, and they knew about it. Some did, as Sarah brought to attention in her work. And with that, it made me wonder, was that also a part of scaring, the youth to conform, behave, don't be considered insane, that this can happen to you? So the fear and the forms of violence to also go hand in hand of perpetuating that control and policing even one another that happens. So there's so much, but I'll circle back to this because I have so many more questions and really look forward to the conversation with you, Sarah. And again, thank you for this important work. And I really hope as many people read this, continue to learn. But I'll come back to a question about medicine. Is as bad medicine is a really important concept, the title of the book. What inspired you, to focus on that? And what is the good medicine? I think it comes through implicitly in your work, and you talk about healing. You refer to futurity, for example, Indigenous futurity, but what's that good medicine and the healing that has to happen, and how you're balancing, we have so much that's damage centered, and it is really traumatic, and we talk about intergenerational trauma, but this is very important to me, is intergenerational healing and that hope coming through your work. So I'd love to hear that. And yeah, so much more I could talk about, but I'll just leave it with that big question. And you can bring up anything else I mentioned, but thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Yako Kia, Farina. Thank you so much for engaging with the book and with my ideas. I guess, bad medicine, it's a suggestion in the first place. I don't over define bad medicine. So I just want to say that, right? And that was sort of intentional. But I also think that in as much as we do have a lot of damage-centered narratives about Native people, we don't have very much about what some of these institutional spaces produced for individual American citizens. So this book is doing sort of both and. So part of the focus is on the productive capacity of these institutional networks for everyday, ordinary, white American citizens, and what that critical purchase was in participating in some of these discipline and surveillance and punitive regimes, right? So one really important dimension of the project is to show how this sort of buy-in to a lot of the ideas that these institutions promoted, or, you know, the power that was held out as a reward for participating in these punitive regimes, how that is a form of bad medicine, right? It's bad news. It's a form of maintaining, you know, inequitable power structures, racist hierarchies, et cetera, right? You know, I mean, to answer your question about what is good medicine, I think the work that we're doing in the room today, right, having these hard discussions, that's a form of good medicine. I'm hesitant also to define that. You know, tribes and nations are working tirelessly around the clock, right, to heal from many of the conversation or the histories that we're having, or I'm sorry, excuse me, the histories that we're discussing in our working group and more generally speaking. You know, and that medicine emerges from that communal work and within our communities and our capacities as, you know, members of those spaces. I viewed my role in writing this book as, you know, helping to make plain some of those truth-telling endeavors. But yeah, I also want to underscore that, you know, the truth, I have this, you know, in various different permutations and places throughout the book. The truth doesn't reside in one person. It's, you know, a collective truth. No one has the, you know, monopoly on the truth. And that emanates from the stories and experiences and testimonies, of course, of survivors and descendants, right? So, you know, there's a lot to think about in terms of medicine, and I can see you're very passionate about the concept. And, you know, I think utilizing that as a framework for my book, I hope it provokes some of those difficult conversations. But yeah, in terms of defining what might be good medicine, again, that resides, right, of course, with our communities, community spaces, original instructions and protocols. Yeah. Thank you so much.
I also want to say, like, coming full circle, that reminds me of how you provide really these deep up close voices, and even in some of the chapters interspersing voices from students' writings that come through, and the appendix that includes some of the letters. That was really wonderful. And then it's also stepping back, you know, giving us a bigger bird's eye view of the connections of these institutions that people would not see or trace and know. So thank you for that. Yeah.
Thanks. Well, yeah, I think now we're gonna spend a few minutes talking about Natalee's book, and then we'll have a bigger discussion.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, can I just add also, we have some flyers of Sarah's book over on the, whatever that piece of furniture is called, with links to where you can purchase it, and my book as well.
Okay, well, I'll start off talking about a Natalee book. So I love your book. I flirt it even.
And my quote on there.
And I think one of the best things about it is just your voice really comes through, and just your incisive criticism of the benevolent whiteness of heroic white women, of the heroic white woman teacher. You point out how teaching is presented as a heroic calling. rooted in 19th century Protestant missionary discourse about the great sacrifices that missionaries made to so-called save, ultimately unsavable communities of color. Like all this in quotes, this is like the language of the missionaries. That part really stood out to me as I reread your book in preparation for this event, that the fact that the discourse of benevolent whiteness really depends on understanding the mission, in this case, teaching Black and Indigenous children, as ultimately one that's destined to fail. White women teachers are heroic precisely because their saving mission is not supposed to fully work, not because they're not good saviors, but because the children of color are unsavable by virtue of being Black or Indigenous. You also point out that the part that is not always said out loud in polite liberal society, but is always implicit, is that white women teachers are understood to be needed because Black and Indigenous parents, families, and communities are not fit to properly raise children. Again, this is all like in the language of white supremacy. And so perhaps even since benevolent whiteness operates through tender violence, as you say, and a colonial language of love, the implication is that Black and Indigenous families do not properly love their children. Therefore, as you write on page 26, benevolent whiteness seeks to displace parents of color through ideological whitewashing of the ideal proper woman and mother, and consequently to replace the Indigenous mother with a white middle-class Protestant mother. And I think there are also connections that we could talk more about to Katie's book, Refusing Settler Domesticity, where she talks a lot more about Native women's domestic labor and so-called scientific motherhood in the Bay Area outing program. But for Natalee, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about how your book addresses this dynamic, like the heroism of the white woman teacher, and their like kind of doom quest to save the unsavable, and also like in what ways do you see contemporary movements for decolonization addressing or not perhaps this white supremacist idea of Black and Indigenous families as pathologically unfit to parent?
I said a lot. When I hear people repeat it back to me, I was like, I said a lot. Yeah, so one of the things that I think I try to make clear in the book is that this idea of benevolent whiteness, like I think of whiteness as ideological, right? So it's not something that's attached to people who are phenotypically white. So any of us who grow up in US schooling systems, it's the water we swim in, right? And so it's also teachers of color who reproduce this benevolent whiteness, right? It's the way that we, if I were to say, everyone close your eyes and picture a good student, right? Well, the poor teachers in the background. But there's a lot about like sitting still, raising your hand, being polite, being, quiet. It's a very feminized ideal, which is why the masculine, what we understand is like, right, we can talk another day about all the invented binaries here, but so to be clear, I wanted it to read as that, right? As it's not something about individual people who are bad guys, right? But that this is a system, and this is a system that has been in place since education was formalized in the United States. And strangely, all these years later, it's actually not that different, right? Even in our college classrooms, when we think about like, what does it mean to look like a good student? What are the behaviors? What are the ways you speak to your professors, right? And I've already lost what the actual question was in saying that because I like the tangents. Well, so I don't know if I got the first half of your question, but in terms of contemporary schools, what I think, and so this is a part that I don't want to plug my next book because it's nowhere near even being drafted, but one of the things I sort of promised myself, so as I was working through this, there were definitely moments where I literally was like throwing books across the room. It was just such a traumatizing experience to read the research and read the writing. And so one of the things that I tried to at least end each chapter with and end the book with was a reminder that in parallel, there has always been resistance and there has always been Indigenous-led schooling movements. And some of the most successful most robust educational movements in the United States have actually been in Black communities, right? And the government does as much as they can to dismantle those systems, right? And we can see that in terms of the Oakland Black Panther schools, even looking at what happened to public schooling post-Hurricane Katrina, right? And then in my book, the chapter that's on the post-war South, I talk about the way that missionaries are sent there specifically to deal with the problem of a newly free Black population, right? So I see, so the new book, I'm really looking more at some of those historical movements outside of schooling or within schooling. So I've been interviewing some folks. I interviewed Erica Huggins, who was the director of the Oakland Community School, which was the Black Panther school here in Oakland. A woman named Sphenia Jones, who was part of one of the survival schools, Indigenous survival schools. And then I'm also interviewing, for lack of a better word, like little people, like not the big famous people, but friends who have been part of like the local kind of smaller community of Black homeschoolers, right? And just for bits of time, like their kids went to, elementary school for a while, like here on this campus actually. And then when it came to middle school, it was just a really violent experience for their children. And so you sort of come in and out of homeschooling, right? And some of the newer movements, some of the forest schools, definitely the Native Hawaiian cultural schools. I always say that's the one place where I'm okay with charters. Not in the Bay Area, not in California. But looking at those movements, which feel very brand new now, but they're actually not, right? We have this uninterrupted history of creating our own educational spaces outside of the formalized learning. So I do, like, in answer to that part, I do see there being some disruption to what we understand as formalized schooling. And it's interesting, like, a colleague of mine, Wanda Watson, who used to teach here at Mills, and I write with her sometimes, we always talk about, what does it mean that we work in the field of education, but we actually don't believe in the system? Like sometimes she's like, should we be doing this, right? It's like, or like people who are teaching in schools who are just like, I actually don't believe in this. It's like, what does this mean? But even in individual classrooms, there are ways that teachers can disrupt these things, right? Like one of, I think, the benefits to teaching is that you're sort of unsupervised most of the time. Like my first year teaching, I was 22 years old. No one ever checked on me, and I was in Texas. But, like there are definitely little ways where individual teachers are doing this work. Like it's interesting because, I was talking to my students about this today in terms of the current political climate, is that we don't have to completely dismantle all of the systems before we begin to build something new. We're always building something new. I mean, something that's actually sort of old, right? But we're always building something different. And and I think that this idea, so what I'm trying to think through in the new book is this idea of Indigenous futurity. And along with, what's already sort of out there on Afrofuturism, because part of that depends on us understanding that we don't need capitalism to fall or settler colonialism to fall before we create an alternative world, right? Like there's not, it's probably not gonna, and it can just be over there doing its own messy thing, and we can still be creating these other things.
Hi, everybody. I'm Katie Kaliya. I'm a professor in history at UC Santa Cruz. Thank you all for being here today. And it's so nice to be able to read your book and celebrate it, Natalee. And what an important read, I just got to say. I would also just say that it's so cool that Tuck and Yang wrote the foreword for your book. Like, what? And I would agree with them. They say right at the beginning, I would like to give this book to a lot of people. And I totally agree. I would actually love current and future educators, everybody, to read this book. I genuinely believe that schooling would be dramatically different if teachers, especially K through 12, would read this book. So thank you for that. I had one question about theory, but I'm also mindful of time, and you kind of were just talking about Indigenous futures and futurities. So that kind of leads to this question. There's a couple of wonderful quotes in here, and I want to read actually two. So one of the quotes that stood out to me was, until we are willing to engage in a thorough genealogical understanding of the power and purpose of teaching, We will remain unable to reimagine schools and teaching in a manner that is decolonial and emancipatory for those we have claimed to serve for the past 2 centuries. That's on 85, love it. And there's, we're done now, okay. And then there's another one that says, basically you provide readers with the imperative that any real possibilities for decolonial schooling must be envisioned through the interrelated lens of Black and Indigenous futurity. Page 13. Can you tell us more about what that looks like and how we can change a system that has done so much harm for, as you say, 2 centuries?
Do not have the answer. I mean, yeah, I mean, I think, I don't know. I feel like I've throughout, so I started off my career as an elementary school teacher at the ripe young age of 22, or however that phrase goes. And I think I had all kinds of ideas. I mean, my ideas changed, right? Like I had all kinds of ideas, and I was such an idealist and was gonna change the whole world. And I actually started school in Oakland, and Sarah teaches there now. Yeah, I think, I mean, you know, it's hard at times, especially in this political moment again, to feel any sort of sense of hope. I think, you know, but also I think like teaching ethnic studies, one of the things I've always kind of had to remind my students is that all of these histories that we study, in all of these stories, people of color are not only victims, right? That's the public school social studies textbook, right? Like you get a couple weeks on each person's victimhood, and then, but now it's all better because we had one time had a Black president, right? But you know, there's always that, right? And so even today, one of the things we were talking about was that you also don't have to do all the things, right? And I think that goes back to what I was saying earlier about we don't have to dismantle entire systems in order to make really big changes, right? And I think for me, I mean, in terms of this book, and if every pre-service teacher read it, right. You know, I think that even if I had read this book prior to teaching elementary school, right, I didn't know the things that were in this book. One of the things I remember thinking in grad school was, if I actually knew the history of education, of schooling, when I was a classroom teacher, I would have been a really different teacher. Even though I thought I was a pretty great teacher, you know, I thought I was, you know, all of the right things and anti-racist and this and that. I also, you know, I didn't know the history of teaching. So I would say things to my, you know, predominantly immigrant kids, like, you can grow up and be anything. Why? Because that's what they told me when I was in school, right? Or like, and so I think if anything, if we can get pre-service teachers to know the history of what they're stepping into, I think that's what the hope is for people to change, right? I don't think schools are full of people who have bad intentions for children. One of the things I wanted, actually, back to one of the early questions around like this doing the work out of love, one of the things I learned that was really interesting in reading these missionary women's diaries was that, so there was a lot of love language, right? I was very interested in this love language. And it started with me thinking about contemporary films where like, you know, Michelle Pfeiffer or Hilary Swank saved the day because they love the kids. But what's interesting is, and it's such reductive, like this is why they don't hire me to write film reviews. One time Michelle Pfeiffer loved the kids. But what's interesting is in these journal articles, or sorry, in these journals and these diaries, the women's love is actually not for the people, it's for God. So they do this work to demonstrate their love for God, which is why it doesn't matter that the students can't be saved, right? Because they are doing this for their own, you know, selfish intentions of like, you know, entering into the kingdom of heaven and whatnot, right? And they still use this language of love toward the students, or even, you know, like similar to what Sarah was saying, like what's the verb? How do you verb that? Childified. What's the opposite of adultified? Infantilized. There's actually a word. Infantilized adults. So, yeah. In any case, I'm just like a master of tangents. And of course, students I just go on and on about it. But I do think that is the hope, right? Oh, and I guess my point being that when people do decide to go into teaching, you know, particularly when you go into teaching in communities where you're not from, I think that it really like. You have to be willing to make a lot of mistakes and acknowledge those mistakes, right? And you have to be much more willing to ask questions and be reflective on all of these little behaviors that we don't see as inherently violent because they're just repetitions of a system that we all went through, right? Yeah, I mean, like to like sit still. I mean, one of the things that I had learned when I was doing ethnographic work was when we looked at the suspension rates in the Bay Area, you had this one school I was at Berkeley, 50% of the suspensions were for something called willful defiance. Now, California finally got rid of that. It's no longer a suspendable category. But willful defiance literally just means like, you didn't take your hat off when I told you to, right? Or you're chewing gum. Or you didn't change your PE into your PE uniform. It's literally anything. It's this big catch-all, category where it's like me as a teacher, you just kind of pissed me off that day, right? Like you pushed the wrong buttons and then I sent you out to the office. But I'm not the bad guy. I don't suspend people. The principal suspends people, even though I sent you, right? And so even for me as a teacher, I remember there being, I don't think I told the story in this book, but this moment, I was teaching middle school PE. It was wild. It was good times. Sweatpants every day. I got to blow a whistle. Good times. No, it was pretty fun. But I remember this moment very clearly where I had these two students. One was this little blonde kid named Nelson. His parents were like university professors, and he was very, very entitled, he refused to do kind of everything, but he would say things like, and I don't know how many of you in middle school PE remember having to run the mile. It's part of like the physical fitness. I know I also did not run the mile. But this kid Nelson was just like, well, my mom told me I should always stand up for what I believe in, and I believe I shouldn't run a mile. And he was always saying stuff like that. And I was like, buddy, your mom didn't finish that lesson. Like, that's not what that means. But the thing is, this kid got talked about as being so precocious and a future lawyer, and right? And then there was this other kid, Kyla, who was just like always yelling in my face. And I was just like, oh my God, that's not how you're supposed to be. That's not being a good student. You're not supposed to yell in my face. I'm the teacher, you're the student, power dynamic, whatever, right? And then one day I was talking to her in the locker room after school, and she was just yelling in my face again, but she was like super excited about something. Like it was a lovely conversation, but she was just yelling right in my face. And I looked at her and I was like, oh, this is just how you talk. This is just like, you're super excited. Like you're way too close for me, but this is, and what hit me was both of them would refuse the same tasks again and again in my class and in their math class and everywhere they went. But Kyle was constantly sitting outside the principal's office, and Nelson was getting talked about as being like a future politician or lawyer, right? And so my kind of like my message to the teachers was like, look, it's not, that doesn't automatically make me the bad guy racist person, right? But like I have learned certain things about what it means to be a good student, or what it means to be like the person in charge of the room and the respect I earn, all of this. And I had to do like really uncomfortable work to realize that these two students are doing the same thing, right? And frankly, Nelson was far more annoying, but, right? And also had parents who would like fight to the death if you had said something to him, right? And so being in schools, like we really, really have to understand so many levels of these power dynamics and racialization and gendered ideas of behavior. I mean, thinking about this now, I'm like, these teaching credential programs shouldn't be 2 years, they should be like 4 or 6 years, But then also just like allowing teachers the space and the time to, not be in these like dumb trainings on weird curriculum, but like to have these conversations and to do inquiry work and to, get to know their students and all of this. And so I know that's like a whole tangent, but that really was like the impetus behind like wanting to do this work.
Well, yeah, I think we could all talk all day, but we have a few more, like 20-ish minutes. Does anybody have a question or comment for Sarah or Natalee or any of us?
I can project.
We have people online.
Oh,
Hey, John. Yeah.
Background check.
Well, first of all, thank you for the panel, the lovely conversation. It's always enriching to just hear about more people doing the work and encouraging us to continue doing the work. Natalee, I want to pick your brain for a second, only because I sat in on a talk earlier this week, and there was a professor that said, sometimes, well, we have to be equal in the classroom, and I just don't think it's, not equal. Trying to think of, the professor said we have to be neutral in our classroom. And,
Gotcha.
we talked after, and she doesn't believe in that, but I just wanted to, on the emphasis of their systems, and then we're in the classroom, and we really want to teach, and we really want to educate. And there's so much learning that happens outside of the classroom too. I think our homes are our first educational settings for a lot of us, especially as a lot of like immigrant children. So how do you stand there in the room full of 30 and other communities, 35 plus classroom students, K through 12 of any kind? And how do you not? I mean, neutrality doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Neutrality is in favor of oppressors. So how are you in the system, but also avoiding neutrality and just giving your students the space to think freely and challenge that as well?
I have never been accused of being neutral. It's part of what gets me in trouble often. But it's interesting, it's too bad that those students walked out because one of them had been telling me about one of their student clubs and they were talking about politics and whatever, and then how another student had said, well, I just don't get involved, I'm neutral. Right, and and I'm also famous for quoting people, but totally wrong. So I'm about to do that now. But you know, there's that quote that says something about, maybe it's Dante, I don't know, like the hottest places in hell are reserved for people who remain neutral in times of great political something, right? So like neutrality is still, it's still a behavior, right? Like it's still a choice, it's still doing something. Yeah, and in the classroom, like, I don't know, because I feel like that's what institutional leaders are telling us now is like, don't make any political statements, and especially if your political statements go against, you know, this whole regime, and here I am broadcast to the world, hello. I'm gonna say all the banned words now, right? Like, you can't be neutral, but one of the things that, I mean, I'm not quite sure exactly what you're asking about the neutrality, but one of the things I've been mindful of now that we're part of this whole different institution, right? It's not like middle college where everyone was sort of like, you know, way out left. Is helping kind of like guide these conversations, especially politically charged conversations, from like a place of like curiosity, right? Like, especially because our students are all 18-year-olds, right? And a lot of their ideas at this point politically are just what they grew up hearing, right? And so we can either be like, well, you know, you're one of the bad guys, you're such a dummy, or you're a racist, or whatever else, or we can ask questions, right? Or we can tell our own personal stories. Like there was a story in the news today, I forgot where it was, but it was some like city council or something. There was a conversation, there was like an anti-trans bill on the docket. And there was this old guy, he was there coming to speak in support of the anti-trans bill. But first, all the people who were, now I'm forgetting which is the answer, but the people who were speaking, who were like mostly trans folks, who were speaking out saying like, you know, we need our rights protected. They went first, right? And so he went like so last, and he got up there and he was like, you know, I'm an old guy and I don't understand any of this. I don't know any gay people and I don't know any trans people. And I was here to say, I want you to pass this anti-trans law. And now I'm gonna say something different because I heard all these stories, right? And so, and that happens, right? Like that does happen. And if it happens in college classrooms, I think this is the place where like it's like the most fertile, with the most access. It's called indoctrination, right? By the people who don't want students to learn. But I think that's been like my work and my challenge here with these students is to be prepared for someone who believes something like entirely different from me, but to like approach it with like curiosity. Someone else want to
Can I add something about that? I think it's also these relationships with the work we do that is connected to our communities, and just something you said reminding me of, it's not only, you know, in the classroom, but reminding like that how interconnected we are, what families, as you said, you know, home is the place we learn. And, you know, a lot of people in my family don't have the same journey I've had in education, even if they go to college or whatnot, or many of my relatives didn't go to college, and, you know, all these dynamics. So for me, it's like, I can't just keep things like this is in the classroom, this is at the university either. It's never like neutral, as we know, for many of us, right, it's sharing that this is killing people I love. It's protecting, you know, how is it affecting my children? And among Diné, you know, our children, we don't even have word for cousin in Diné Bizad, and it's like that conceptualization of these are our brothers, our sisters, our children, looking out for each other. So sharing that when people have this attitude of, oh, you're getting uncivil, you are disagreeing, you know, disagree with civility, or I agree to disagree and let's walk away, or you're, you know, being an activist as a bad thing, like where they label that, or you're taking, you know, you're being divisive or something, like all these kind of labels that I think, that point of neutrality and where apathy or the omission of action or even compliance with all these kind of issues going on. I think it's helping people to understand, like, there's people, we cannot pretend we're neutral even, because this is violence, this is toxicity that we're dying and our people are. And to bring that understanding, like I've met really interesting, very, very different people in areas that I've interacted with, and sharing, you know, where we can share and have a conversation and bring like what these intellectual conversations are showing, like this is the impact, this is bring community and connect students with community, I think is really important and impactful. It can't just be some kind of scholarship sitting on the shelf, or as people frame higher education, sometimes it's the ivory tower. It's not that, or for some it might be, but you know how to, I think, folks here shake those lines, like show that it can't be, and it's not. It's not real.
Any other questions?
Thank you all. This question is for Natalee, but for all of you, of course. As a TK teacher, so I'm within the system right now, and I feel like I am what you described, like I'm in the system, but I don't believe in the system. But I'm within a school where this phenomenon of benevolent whiteness is just permeating the school, as any school. And without just waiting for those teachers to retire, what are some ways that we can disrupt the system in like tangible ways that you think we can disrupt this cycle of benevolent whiteness? And we have PDs, we have trainings, but what are some sustainable, like tangible ideas that you might have for disrupting this?
Katie was my kid's TK teacher for a little second, and then when she was in teacher training, I don't know, because I'm not sure exactly what you mean by that at your school site. Make them all live. Yeah.
Have you ever told the story you just told us?
Well, yes, that's what I was thinking, right? Is like, I think that the more you sort of, so people really don't like feeling like they're the bad guys, right? But the more you can sort of parallel tell, like, well, here's this one story that I realized where I was doing this, right? Yeah, I think that, I mean, one of the things I had hoped for when I was approaching this from more of an ethnographic, lens was teachers doing a lot of like reflective journals and things, and like thinking about like, let's all think of a moment when we send a kid out of class and what was happening, like what were you physically feeling, and again, all of this depends on there being time and funding, right? To have teachers really sit and reflect on these things, because otherwise, I mean, like you all know, because you're in the classroom, right? Like I don't think I ever went to the bathroom the whole time I taught elementary school, right? I never ate lunch, right? And so there's certainly not time to just sort of sit and reflect. But I do think that, just like telling those stories, right? In the same way that in that city council meeting, like listening to stories got someone else to reflect and think differently. I don't know. or ask me to be paid to do a professional development.
In charge of 10,000. Yeah.
Yes, your fiance.
How you doing? I'm Josh, PE teacher, middle school. Got my son. Grew up in Berkeley. So, my question is to Sarah about schools that go out with the bravado that they're trying to educate the or indigenous and Native American people, such as American Indian model schools, which kind of came here in a rob Peter to pay Paul kind of thing, because they shut down Lakeview Elementary and opened that institution up. And when I would drive by, I would see nothing. I would not see indigenous people there. I mainly saw people of Chinese or Japanese or other Asiatic descent, as opposed to the partner group that the school was named after. They also have a school in downtown Oakland as well, in the middle of Chinatown. So with institutions like that, are they really just using the name and not providing the service to those indigenous people? Or are they hitting their targets and making an impact?
So there was a charter school in Oakland. It's called Native American, was it
Resource.
American Indian Public Charter School. It started with just one school and then they expanded. And I don't know, I mean, initially they were meeting to teach Native American students, but it did just become sort of like a very intense, almost military academy, test prep focus. But it was always sort of bizarre that it was called like the American Indian Charter.
Yeah. Now they call it AIMS.
AIMS, yeah.
Now they just call it AIMS now.
Yeah.
But it started off with that American Indian model schools. But I was wondering about where the native, the indigenous people were and how were they modeled for them. And that set them apart.
That's really an interesting question. I was not familiar with that, so I appreciate that background. Not knowing the specifics, I'll leave that to the local folks. Maybe Katie or Natalie can wrangle that one. But I do want to say something about how this notion of indigenous, vanishing, disappearance, I think that's pretty prevalent perhaps in what you're describing here. As just sort of a historic structure and trope that plays out across the country and really across the globe, right, in many different permutations. So the notion that we could slap the American Indian whatever name on a charter school that is not in fact for indigenous people that we know of might be one example of the ways in which indigenous people are always already presumed to have vanished, to have disappeared, that they do not bear any, contemporary relationship to the landscape or particular urban areas or, the world in general today, period, which we know is not true. And of course, there are many, many dedicated universities, colleges, and schools created expressly by Native people, for Native people. There are Native students across the world. This doesn't sound like one of those places, but perhaps Natalie or Katie can address that more pointedly. Yeah, thank you.
I would just say to this question, if you're looking for an institution that does serve Native people, that is built and created by Native people, that is Oakland-based, and that is for Native students out here, I would recommend the American Indian Child Resource Center, AICRC, right there on basically by Lake Merritt, Lake in like the Merritt, like Euclid, like that area. It's an institution that's existed since 1974, and they provide all kinds of resources for basically Oakland-based and larger, adjacent cities for Native students. So It's in the name and they actually do the work and it's Native students there. So just want to give a shout out to CRC for all the wonderful work that they do. They have a middle school program and a high school program. They literally shuttle kids to and from like Skyline, Street Academy, et cetera. So it's Native students that are all across this community. And yes, I think that's one positive example of an institution that really does serve and continues to serve Native families across the Bay.
Also, both questions recently remind me of even this work of, what is it? Tenderness, care, love, medicine. Because and what even is in a name, and why, how can such things like even the quote good intentions, the benevolent experiment of these kind of institutions, whether schools, right, education, of course, to support youth, to educate is supposed to be a good thing. And it's also so fraught and difficult when all the support mechanisms and such are being slashed, and all the hurdles and all the challenges. It's a matrix, and also a hydra in so many directions and ways. But I think about what is really love, what is really care, and as was brought up in these different conversations, like the different points of today's conversation, is that having to pause introspectively and ask, is this being done from an individual perspective, a mindset, or are we really thinking about our relationality and doing what we can? Like, can we understand, can we empathize and not be afraid of empathy? And understand and see the humanity even in the people who, really, we have a lot of cause to want to fight fire with fire and all that, like a lot of cause to feel darkness consume us and negativity, but to be the one to radically care, as that was a term used in Sarah's book that resonated with me, because care and maintenance was also used to really constrain, control, dehumanize people. But what is real care and love for a people and community? Now, circling back to the recent question about the school that in name uses American Indian model, but who is it really serving and to what purposes, and these kind of questions being raised, and other schools that can model, like actually model this kind of, or programs that can model this kind of work, brings up points about its sovereignty, and that these are lands of many peoples, and not only peoples, but many nations who have stories, since time immemorial, and these lands, and that we can live together with that constellation of many sovereignties and peoples and nations. And so even with these schools, like it can feel like a rabbit hole of, well, all right, who's American Indian, who's Indigenous, on and on. But I think that not to forget and to think about how sovereignty is a part of should be a part of these conversations. And in Sarah's book, what stood out to me was a thread about how there's forces that are afraid of that plurality. They don't want to live in a space of multiple sovereignties, right? Even the sense of like English only. Hawaiian is, in that point you brought up of a woman saying Hawaiian is a dead language. Why is she so scared of Hawaiian or another language? It's like the fear of even language, and the executive order that English is the official language of the United States, when there's areas where Spanish has been spoken much longer, or, on and on, all the many languages. And that's so beautiful, right? That beauty and the knowledge and the education and the archives and so much epistemology is in the language, right? And so I just, your question reminded me of that too, of is sovereignty brought up in the formation of that school and language sovereignties, you know, all these kind of aspects, and to not be afraid of that, but how people can exist in harmony and peace, and that's possible, and to not be afraid, rather than the power struggles that happen over what it means to control or who shapes it.
I think we're about out of time, but we'll be here and we can chat more and eat the snacks. And thank you so much for joining us on a Friday, and to our tech team for managing this.
Thank you.
I'm quite crazy story. That's part of